Are there any statutory impediments or administrative regulatory impediments to doing the sorts of things we've just been talking about, which is the draft bids, the meeting with vendors, the exchange of information?
I don't think so, because we've been doing it successfully now. So that's why I was saying I think that the current statutory framework gives us the flexibility to do that. Now, as we go forward and come up with other models, because we are even today doing alternative procurement models, some where we do risk sharing, where we ask the vendor, like our cloud situation, where we say, okay, we'll pay you based on the money you save us, or we'll pay you based on the business that you help develop or the revenue you drive. Some of those sorts of things are very helpful because the state doesn't have to put any money out of pocket. The vendor comes in and puts in a system, and we don't have to pay until they actually show that it works. But as we explore those and look at even future models, we may require some flexibility at that point. But to this point, we really haven't found anything that has kept us from trying to be innovative and trying to implement the recommendations that the task force put out.
Are we insisting that that agencies, departments, maybe it's your department, ask prospective vendors or contractors for lists of clients or customers that they've worked for in the past?
We do.
And then gone out to do our due diligence? Because that was one of the issues that bothered me, as I recall, during one of the procurement projects we looked at, whether or not adequate due diligence was accomplished prior to selection of a particular vendor.
Sure. So we do, when we evaluate a bid, we evaluate everything from the bidder's track record and their qualifications, let's call it, of not only of their staff but also of the company. Have you done or taken on a project and successfully delivered it of similar scope and size? And so we do that. The one area where we're focusing on, and it's going to take some effort to develop the skill set in government, is how do you adequately assess the financial viability of some of these vendors too? Because if you're going to take on a very large project in California, especially one that's risk-based, we got to know that you have the financial viability to pull it off.
Do we ask for capitalization data?
I don't know the answer to that, only because I'm not really that versed in how we do our financial due diligence. But I can certainly find that out and get back to you.
Or at least take a look at it, because it's certainly something that if you raise the issue, but it is a valid issue,
right,
you can say it's one of the recommendations has to do with a staffing plan, and state ought to have one too, but the vendor comes in with a staffing plan that has 25 people on the staffing plan, and the question is, do they have the capitalization to maintain the payroll?
Right.
And we can ask for that. There isn't anything that Pardon me?
Identify yourself.
Oh, sorry. Forgot.
That's okay. We're having a chat.
Yeah. Marnielle Voss. I'm with I'm acting over the technology procurements underneath Carlos and Andrea for the Department of Technology.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. But we do have the ability to do that currently. Where the question comes in is who is going to do the analysis of that, about whether the supplier is capable, and a lot of that comes in at the part where we actually get a proposal to look at, to see that they're looking for 3 years to implement the system, and they want us to provide this, and they're going to provide that. So we need to do that business analysis and that financial analysis of the supplier community at that point, which means we still need to have competition at that point, so we have different people to pick and choose from.
And I guess, of course, part of your due diligence with respect to past contracts and performance, if done thoroughly, should reveal whether or not the contractors had past difficulties meeting payroll, keeping appropriate people on staff. And
well, and the other aspect of it, too, is whatever criteria we end up using and whatever analysis and evaluation we end up developing has to be defensible. Because, if you're a company and you don't win based on some evaluation of your financial viability, for example, they might protest that, and we have to be able to have something that we can stand behind. So again, those are some of the things that we're working through and figuring it out. But I don't think there's anything that keeps us from being able to do that, even under the current statutes.
And as we're walking through these recommendations, we'll get to the one having to do with qualitative versus quantitative selection criteria and the fear of protests, and I would like to talk to you a little bit about that. But the next recommendation on my list has to do with the governing body and who makes the decisions and the single senior project executive. And we see in the state of California, particularly in the absence of what I consider a centralized IT system, which we were just talking about, you have multiple people and multiple agencies that have hands in this IT procurement pot.
Sure. In the discussion you had with the task force, I did want to just kind of do a little bit of just clarification. So when I look at governance, and when we look at governance, we look at it from two perspectives. Governance for IT as a whole, is who reviews and approves projects, who gets to fund them, and then who owns them. That's kind of at a macro level. When it comes to an individual project, one of the things that is a requirement, and it's already required under our approval process, is that the department, that project, have a governance structure for making project-level decisions. Generally, what we require is that you have the business side, a high-level executive who can make decisions for the department. On the business side, sitting on an executive governance committee that gets to make decisions around, do you change anything that comes up during the course of a project, necessary changes to the scope of a project, to a schedule, to the timing, to, devoting the level of resources, whatever issues come up, and there really are, literally hundreds of issues that can come up. And so that governance structure, I think, is what the task force was talking about when they say you need to have decision level folks that have enough pull within the department to say, okay, we need to send some experts in licensing to go and test the licensing portion of the system, or we need to have people that are construction managers, or people that know about engineering. If you're building a system for Caltrans, for example, that can go in and sign off that yes, this system actually meets your business needs. So part of the governance structure that the task force is recommending here is part of what we do when we look at under stage one, when we assess an organization's capacity to pull it off. One of the things we look at is, do you have a governance structure that can help you effectively make decisions on projects?
And do you think it matters that you're dealing with people who have other jobs that are completely unrelated to IT at the time that these projects are moving down the pipe?
It matters a lot for a couple of reasons. One is you really need people outside of the IT shop that understand. If we're going to ask a department to change its business operations, you need people from the business side of the house. If we're going to say the way you issue licenses or take in applications or issue benefits has to change, you need the people that run that side of the operation to be involved. Secondly, they're the ones that are going to be the end users of the system. It's not going to be the IT shop.
It's a difference between providing input, right, and controlling the process. I mean, you clearly need that input from the end users. I'm just wondering if in your experience you have seen situations where top-down direction from somebody whose focus is really not IT, but is involved in the substantive operation of his department, creates adverse consequences because...
In my experience, it's actually been the other way around.
Okay.
It's when departments say, that's an IT project, let the IT shop handle it. Those are the ones that end up having the most problems. When it's the business side of the house saying, we own the system, we own the results of it, and we own the outcomes, they're the ones that are in there making sure it's designed well, that it's fully tested, that their folks get trained, and if they have to change the way they do business, they're the ones that have to make that change. It's not to say that you don't need still a skilled project team running the technical side of the project. You definitely need that. But when it comes to decision making, and even in negotiations and discussions with the contractors, you definitely need the business side of the house. And it's more, I've seen the successful projects, that is a common element. It's a very engaged business side partner. So,
and maybe it's our fault. Maybe we need to make sure we develop a culture of accountability. And if we develop a culture of accountability, and as I think we are beginning to do so in state government, particularly in this area,
sure,
as technology changes and projects move on, maybe it'll work.
I think it's a couple of things. I think it's accountability. I think it's adequately training and educating folks as to, why it's important that they're engaged. So, I mentioned our Project Academy series. The very first class that we taught was how to be an effective project sponsor. And it was really aimed at the business side, so that we teach them, how do you ask the questions? What are the questions to ask? How can you tell if your project is off kilter or not? How do you understand what these technical people tell you? It's those sorts of classes that are going to help as well. But it's accountability, it's education and training, and then it's also working with the vendor community so that they know what they're bidding for, what they're on the hook to deliver, and building into the contracts some management mechanisms that allow you to manage vendor performance. And we're, like I said, we're working on all of those. I know we'll get to it at some point, but
We'll move through it. I'll stop talking, but recommendation number 6 has to do with the Office of Systems Integration, and I think you touched on that, and you certainly know
Correct.
that. So if that model works, I would encourage you to encourage those who are probably listening to this session to give some thought to that.
Well, as I said, it's very near and dear to my heart, and I know it's a model that works.
What about the recommendation 7 has to do with a formal staffing plan, and I guess this applies both to the state and to the vendor community.
It really does, and so I mentioned that we've done a pretty comprehensive assessment. One of the things that we also did is we went out and talked to the vendor community and said, okay, what causes projects to fail and how do we do better? And I meet with them very regularly as well. And one of the things that they do complain about is, hey, you're asking us to hold up our end of the bargain and send an A-team, but the state isn't on the hook to do the same sort of thing. And I think that's what this recommendation is about.
Why does the state? Why do we fall down? Would it help if we were centralized, or does it have nothing? Does it have little to do with that, and more to do with the fact that we're involving people who have other jobs to do besides?
I think it has to do with both of those aspects. One is, I think it would help if we had just a consistently trained and skilled cadre of project people on the technical side of a project. But beyond that, really what you do want is you want those folks that are the best and the brightest in the department on the business side of the house. And as you pointed out, they have full-time jobs. So when we do our assessment of an organization's capacity to take on a project, that's what we look at. In that first stage is, are you willing to dedicate your best and brightest to go work on this project, and show us that you have the capacity to do that. So I think it's both. I think you have very busy people with very busy jobs, but those are the folks you need to help you effectively design and test and train and implement a project.
And that may change depending on what we do in the state of California in terms of the way we organize the delivery of IT project management services.
Even if we were to centralize and say, let's take OSI and make that the project management office for the entire state.
More likely your department, but
or that'd be great with me too. But if it's our department, even if you establish a project office with really well-trained project managers and technical teams, you are still going to need those folks that know how payroll runs, or how you issue licenses, or how you build roads, or whatever it is, and how you use the technology in those spaces. So it's going to be both.
You need access to the specialists.
Access and a commitment that they'll be there when you need them. But we do hear about that from the vendors, and so that is one of the things that's built into our stage 1 of the project process.
Recommendation 8 talks about you developing inside your department, I guess, a cadre of talented IT professionals and legal staff. So has that happened? Do you need additional resources?
It has happened, and it is happening. So under when IT procurement got moved over to my shop, we got a set of resources, staff, that included some staffing for the procurement folks and some for on the legal side. Separate and apart from that, we've carved out through redirection a unit which we call our consulting division. And what we did is, again, going back to the lessons that we've learned, say, hey, we really need folks that can go in and help a project and get hands-on when they run into problems around, business requirements, around how do you put in place a good governance structure, around, how do you do a good data management or data migration plan. So we've established a division within our shop. Right now it's staffed at 9 people, but I'm constantly looking for basically efficiencies from within my department to bring in resources and say, okay, I need an expert on testing. I need an expert on data conversion. I need an expert on contract negotiations, those sorts of things. So that's been established. We established it towards the end of last calendar year. And so they have now been effectively engaged in going out to projects that are having challenges and bringing them back on board. So we're working on it, but I think it's going to be a continuing need. We haven't come forward and asked for any positions yet, primarily because I want to, as I said, we've been going through our own assessment and saying the work we're doing there is not as much value. So let's stop doing that. It's bureaucratic. It doesn't add value. And let's take those resources and focus them on something that actually is going to pay off. So we've been doing that as well.
Good. I asked the task force folks about their 9th recommendation, which has to do, as I describe it, with management of expectations and contingency dollar amounts and how much over a project should run, how much longer should a project take than is specified in the contract. And do you have any thoughts on that? And is that something that we need to deal with here?
I do. I think there's a couple of ways of getting at it. The way we've tried to get at it is to make sure that by the time you propose a budget and a schedule, it's much closer to reality based on, like I said, actually having gone out to the market and having a very clearly defined set of business objectives. So I think that's one way to try and minimize that. I have seen, though, on some projects where I guess you'd call it a contingency bucket has been built in. In fact, most projects have a set aside for unanticipated tasks or, things that could happen during the life of a project. Generally, though, that's dealt through the budget process, and so I think as a project practice, it's probably a good idea. But in reality, what happens is oftentimes projects and departments have to go negotiate that with finance and with the legislature through the budget process. But I have seen it done successfully.
I think their 10th recommendation calls on you to do an annual report to us or to someone having to do with your use of alternative contracting. I think that would be a valuable tool. What do you think?
I think it would be, actually. And, we are already, as a state, using alternative contracting. The more recent examples of it, or the most recent examples that I can think of, are the CROSS project that Board of Equalization has under development. It's a procurement in process right now, but it's going to be one of those alternative procurements, and it's a risk sharing one, in which we're going out to the vendor community and say, come in and bid, help us drive increased tax collections and tax revenues, and you get paid based on the revenues that are generated. EDR over at Franchise Tax Board was another one where they did that, and that's actually been working great. I think they're right now at 200% or 184% of projected revenues. So it's working well, and the project is going well. But I think as we do more and more of these, I think it would be valuable to say, okay, how's it working, and where do we need to tweak it?
And perhaps you could take a look at Appendix E of the task force report. You may already have done so, I'm sure, just to make sure that the various alternative contracting methods that the task force identified are permissible under the existing California statutory or regulatory framework. And if not, let us know, so in the legislature
Sure.
we can promulgate some statutory or
Sure.
reform.
Yeah, that might be where we would need some flexibility. But I know we read it back in August when it came out, but I don't remember them all, to be honest. So I'd be happy to do that.
What about we talked a little bit about pre-screening vendors, one-on-one conversations, but also I gather to the extent that we allow departments and agencies to continue to manage their own procurement, what about the suggestion that we have a library of contract provisions? Or is that not required because you control the
Well, we do departments don't get to do their own procurements unless they get delegation, and they usually don't get delegation unless they're good at it. So, running out their own RFPs, they don't get to do that unless they're delegated. And usually those are smaller ones or very competent organizations. But having said that, I think it is a good idea. I know Department of General Services and our own department already have a set of model terms and conditions. These were revised recently, where we went out and DGS went out to the vendor community and said, okay, what in here keeps you from bidding, and what in here drives up your costs, or what doesn't actually work? And they did that with the state agencies as well. But those are really only a starting point. Some of the other things that we need to do, and we've been working on this, is to identify how do we factor in effective vendor performance management tools or mechanisms into those contracts. Every time that something goes wrong on a project, we look at it and say, okay, how come we weren't able to stop this? Or if it's, if it's an issue of, we're not able to enforce vendor performance, or we're getting bad quality, or, untimely deliverables, how come under our contract we weren't able to get them to step up their game? So I think it's a good idea to create, basically a library of, hey, you should make sure you have this provision in your contract. Or, as new licensing models come out, or new technology delivery models, that we're able to modify the terms and conditions. So we're doing that, I guess, we're kind of doing it in an informal way now, where as we develop, good contracts, and I'll give you an example of one that might be helpful. On one of the procurements that we're doing for a system down in Health and Human Services, we had a provision in the contract that requires the vendor who's building the system to give access to our independent experts, our IVMV and project oversight vendors, to look at their scheduling and project management tools, where they actually schedule their resources, where they do their testing and document what their progress is. What that does is that enables us to make an independent assessment of progress and not rely on the vendor to say, well, here's where we are in our testing, and here's where we are in resolving defects or whatever. I thought that was a really good provision. So the idea is, okay, let's take that provision and share it, and we have been doing that, share it with other departments and other projects to say, as you negotiate your contract, make sure you have this in there. More importantly, where we find provisions that are really troublesome, to be able to take those provisions and say, let's make sure you don't have this in your contract, because this is a problem. It's hard to administer, or it's confusing to vendors, or they read it one way and jack up their price because they think we mean this when we really don't mean that. So we're doing that in an informal way, but I think the idea of creating a library would be a good one.
Maybe you mentioned this. Is there any IT procurement in the state of California currently that is utilizing an incentive contract fee, where if the contractor brings the project in on time, on budget, or some version of that, the contractor gets additional financial?
I haven't seen it on the IT side. I've seen it, in road building or bridge building, those sorts of things. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily the recommendation of how it would go about it. Some of the things, again, which I think we could do under our current statute is just, right now when we pay a vendor, we usually pay them based on deliverables. You deliver a certain piece of technology or a certain product that's required as part of the contract, and we'll submit an invoice and we pay you. What we do is we hold back some of that payment. It's called the holdback. And so I think either changing payment milestones or incentivizing them by saying we'll hold back less. The better your track record, the less we hold back. Or in some cases, where we're trying to disincent bad behavior, to actually put in sanctions like liquidated damages or the ability to increase those holdbacks. I think those are actually, what I've seen, those can actually be very effective management tools.
And is that because IT contracts are significantly different than construction?
I don't know why we haven't done it, or why you can do that in construction. I guess maybe because in construction, You have a tangible asset. If you have a partially built road, maybe you have at least something there.
Or you can throw more bodies on it and pour more concrete. But
could be.
I assume that's something you're willing to take a look at.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'd ask you to do so, because if it is an effective tool, then I gather from the task force representative's testimony, it's going to require some public contract code
It
modification
might. I
on
don't know
our
off the
part.
top. I'll tell you what we have done, though. So we went out. I mentioned how one of the things we're very interested in is factoring in vendor performance. So one of the things that we've been doing is these forums where we go out to the stakeholder community, both the vendors and the state agencies, and say, how do we? Well, here's what we did. We went to the vendors and said, I want to factor in your performance in the way that we evaluate bids, so that if you had a really bad performance, that that counts against you. And more importantly, if you know you're going to be evaluated based on your performance, it'll incent you to perform well. So we asked them, how do we do that? Give us some ideas. And what if we tried this? What if we tried that? We didn't get any of the vendors come back, and if they're watching the hearing, they might say, hey, I got a good idea for you now. But none of them came back and said, hey, how about incentive payments? They did talk about, hey, release the holdbacks or reduce holdbacks. They did talk about developing a report card. One that could be shared publicly, and where you negotiate at the beginning of the contract to say, we're going to hold you accountable to the quality of your staff, the timeliness of your deliverables, the quality and completeness of your deliverables, those sorts of things. So they didn't come up with that idea of doing incentives.
Well, that points to I think the vendor database that the task force representative spoke to today. So, I mean, have we taken any action to begin to implement some vendor database or some version of that, whether it includes a report card or not?
Yeah.
What are we doing, and if not, why not?
Yeah, that we have, and that's, as I said, we took over procurements in July, so we've been working at it, and we've been, working. Our approach is to try and work with all of the stakeholders and say, we think this is a good idea. How do we implement it? And if we try this way, what are the problems that we're not foreseeing? So the whole effort around vendor performance and the vendor report card came out of that, where we went out and said, how do we factor in your performance, and does it cause any problems? Because there could be problems. So, for example, if we say you're going to get a grade or some assessment based on how you've done in California, well, what if it's a new company, or a company that hasn't done business in California, or a company that's had a big project failure, but it was in the state of Tennessee or something?
Does it matter whether the business has been done in California for purposes of our scorecard?
In some cases, well, we haven't finalized it, but those are the sorts of questions we're asking the community. Say, does it? Because if you say, oh, well, yes, it will only count what you've done in California, that could disincent, or, that could limit competition from new companies or companies that may have been working in California, but all they've done is private sector stuff.
Right, but IT is IT, so IT for the state of Massachusetts, while the functionality may be different, IT for Massachusetts ought to be IT for California.
It is and it isn't, because, California and the scale and the complexity of California versus Massachusetts, it's pretty significant. So,
but that has to be a factor that you apply to your evaluation and the grade that you attach to prior performance.
So that's why we're asking, help us come up with a model that works. And what are the unforeseen circumstances if we try one and don't factor in those sorts of considerations?
One of the significant recommendations I thought that the task force made, and it applies to your department, is that you conduct sort of a post-procurement review, post-project review and assessment of these various technology projects in the state, and I assume it would be a written report that would be accessible by people like me.
Sure.
Have you taken steps to implement that recommendation, and if so, how, and if not, why not?
Yeah, so we already do. It's called the Post-Implementation Evaluation Report, and I think LAO mentioned it's been in place for a long time. So what we're doing is working at, as we modify the factors and the items that we review in approving a project, we're going to evaluate the criteria by which we do the post-implementation evaluation as well.
Does it depend on input, for example, the Controller's Office? I assume that's why you want an assessment by the Controller's Office, so you can complete your post.
Well, we want it for a couple of reasons, but we would look at I guess if your question is, does it include input from the department or the project? Yes, and they're the ones that would be charged with the responsibility for developing it. But we would also want input from the independent project oversight and IV&V, the independent experts that do validation and verification of the project as well. But to the question of why do we want the assessment of the SCO project, we want to know what went wrong. We want to know, what lessons can we harvest from that, and more specifically, we want to know if the investment that they've made in the technology is the right. Is this the right set of technology? And what do we do from here? Should we continue with that investment in technology, or do we look at a different technology model? So we want we want a pretty comprehensive report. And I think, if you're looking at what sort of a scope, I would say look at the DMV assessment, because that was pretty comprehensive, and it included, asking what did we do wrong, or how could we improve our game.
And moving backwards from the post-project report, during the course of these IT procurement efforts, where the department or the agency is essentially running the show inside the agency, how does the Department of Technology inject itself into that process to make sure, for example, that if red flags are going up inside the quality control committee or whatever we call it, or the steering committee or whatever those various names are, I've lost the bubble on that.
Governance structure, governance
Right.
committee.
That you, as the Department of Technology, are made aware of problems at that point that you can hopefully then parachute in to solve.
Sure.
Is that an intelligent question?
Yes, it is. It's a very good question. And so here's how we do it. First and foremost, through this process, before a project gets launched. But let's say once a project is launched, depending on the level of complexity, we might actually have folks embedded on the project doing oversight. And they would be akin to like your county inspector, right? If you're taking on a building project, the inspector comes in to make sure you're building the code, that you're following good construction practices, et cetera, et cetera. So part of what our oversight division does is to do exactly that, to go in and monitor and track and report on issues as they see them and how the project is doing. So they report to me, and they also report to the project team to say, and into this governance structure, which is why it's important to have high-level executives involved with it, to say, hey, we have some issues going on here, and to make recommendations as to how to make those fixes. Separate and apart from that, I meet every month with the departments, especially on the big projects, and bring them in and say, okay, let's review your projects and what's going on. So I take the information that my staff have shared with me, and we go through and say, what's the progress? What are the issues? What are the challenges? And what are you doing about it? And then I meet separately with the vendors. So if you're the project vendor on project ABC, I bring them in and ask them, what are you doing to fix these issues, or what's the issue here, and ask them also what for their assessment of what's going on in the project. And sometimes they'll tell me, well, this department is lagging, or their staff aren't adequately trained, or whatever issues they might be. And so we're able to work with the department and with the vendor to come up with solutions for those. In some cases, like I said, they need an extra shot of resources or an extra shot of expertise, and that's where the consulting division comes in, where we send those folks in on short-term engagements to go in and help the department address particular issues. So that's the way we do it.